Welcome back, my dear crime lovers. This is a new episode of the history of the American Mafia, brought to podcast by Fabio Fabiano, translated and read by me, Grace Cadlisi. I do hope you enjoy this new episode. Now we're starting to talk about the big names in the American Mafia, and one of those is Al Capone, or as his name should be pronounced, Al Capone, but obviously he's known in history with his naturalized American Al Capone name. He was born into an immigrant family in Brooklyn, New York in 1899. His father, Gabriele, was a barber and his mother, Teresa, a seamstress. They both came from Campania in the south of Italy, although the exact location is not known. The Capones had 9 children. They arrived in the States in 1893 and settled in Brooklyn. Al Capone attended a Catholic school with little success, and he often got into trouble. He was very intelligent and proved to have exceptional organization skills. Al Capone dropped out of school around the age of 14, worked several trades in Brooklyn, and joined a notorious street gang. Johnny Torrio, one of the most prominent criminals on the East Coast of the United States, who would become his mentor, was the leader of the gang, and Lucky Luciano was amongst the other members. He got involved in crime, first joining small, inconsequential gangs and eventually joining the 5 Point Gang, the infamous and feared Irish gang that operated in Manhattan. He began working for Frankie Yale in his early 20s. He was hired as a bartender at a club in Coney Island. One evening, during his work shift at the club, he made a crude comment about a girl. Her brother attacked him with a knife, slashing his left cheek. For these scars, he would be, from then on, nicknamed Scarface. He always said they were war wounds and tried to hide them in photos. At the age of 19, he married May Josephine Coughlin, an Irish girl with whom he had a son. In the 1920s, after living briefly in Baltimore, at Torrio's invitation, Capone joined him in Chicago. There, Torrio had become an influential lieutenant in the Colosimo Mafia clan. Capone arrived around 1919. He started out as a bartender and a bouncer in one of Colosimo's brothels. He contracted syphilis almost immediately, but he didn't seek treatment for it, unaware of the consequences. In fact, as a direct cause of the disease, he later suffered from dementia and frequent fits of violence. The rackets generated by the enactment of the Prohibition Amendment gave birth to illegal production, distillation, and distribution of beer and liquor. These were regarded as growing businesses. Torrio, supported by Al Capone, intended to make the most of the opportunities. The association also developed interests in legitimate businesses in the fields of cleaning and interior painting and decorating. Contracts began to be stipulated with public officials and trade unions. Following the murder of Big Jim Colosimo, Torrio very soon managed to take the reins of the gang, and Al Capone gained experience and expertise as his deputy. In 1925, Torrio was seriously injured in an ambush where he miraculously managed to survive. Once recovered, Torrio relinquished control of the mafia family to Al Capone. The Brain, as he was known as in the underworld, indeed retired and moved to Brooklyn. Capone had built a fearsome reputation in the cutthroat gang rivalries of the period, fighting to gain and maintain control of the underworld in different areas of Chicago. That reputation grew as rival gangs were eliminated or nullified, and the suburb of Chico became, in effect, a fiefdom of the Capone mob. The Valentine's Day Massacre which took place on February the 14th, 1929, could be considered the peak in the era of Chicago's gang violence. 7 members of Bugs Moran's bootlegging gang, Al Capone's Irish criminal rival, were machine-gunned against a garage wall by killers, posing as cops. The blame for the massacre was immediately placed on the Capone mafia family, although enemy number 1, as Capone was labelled, was in Florida at the time of the murder. The FBI was called to investigate this heinous massacre. The Bureau of Investigation's jurisdiction during the 1920s and early 1930s was more limited than it is now, and wars between gangs and pillages of the period fell outside the Bureau's investigative authority. In 1929, Capone was in fact responsible for the San Valentino massacre, in which 7 Irish gangsters were killed. He also lured Giovanni John Scalisi, Alberto Anselmi and Giuseppe Joe Giunta, 3 Sicilian mobsters, into a trap who were causing him trouble. He invited them to dinner, then killed them with a baseball bat. His men finished them off with gunshots. In October 1930, as part of the so-called Castellamarese War, Capone was authorized by Joe Masseria to eliminate Giuseppe Aiello, also known as Joe, who had associated him with Salvatore Maranzano, head of the family opposed to Masseria. In 1931, after the killing of Masseria, Capone himself hosted a meeting in Chicago to which the bosses of all the families in the United States were invited to discuss implications of the victory of Maranzano, who, on that occasion, had elected himself boss of bosses. The planned and executed assassinations by Al Capone and his men attracted the attention of the authorities, who in 1930 declared Al Capone public enemy number 1. Public opinion and mass media were all focused on Al Capone. The Treasury Department launched an asset investigation into Al Capone, who officially owned a real estate agency and an antique store. The FBI investigation into Al Capone arose from his reluctance to appear before a federal grand jury on March 12, 1929, in response to a subpoena. On March 11th, his lawyers filed a motion to defer his appearance. The lawyers presented a sworn medical report dated the 5th of March. The medical certificate attested that Capone suffered from pneumonia and bronchitis from January the 13th to February the 23rd, while in Miami, therefore was unable to travel to Chicago for health reasons. The hearing was postponed to March the 20th. At the request of the United States Attorney Office, agents of the Bureau of Investigation took on statements that Capone frequented racetracks in the Miami area. He had traveled by plane to Bimini in the Bahamas and took a cruise to Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas. The feds also collected evidence that Al Capone had been questioned at the Dade County Attorney's Office, and he had appeared in good health on each of these occasions. Capone appeared before a federal grand jury in Chicago on March the 20th, 1929, and completed his testimony on March the 27th. As he left the courtroom, he was arrested by officers for contempt of court, an offence for which the penalty could be up to 1 year in prison and a $1,000 fine. He paid $5,000 and was released. On May 17, 1929, Al Capone and his bodyguard were arrested in Philadelphia for possession and the carrying of a weapon concealed under his garments. Within 16 hours, they were both sentenced to 1 year. Capone served his sentence and was released after 9 months for good conduct on March 17, 1930. On February 28, 1931, Capone was found guilty in federal court of contempt and was sentenced to 6 months in the Cook County Jail. his appeal of that sentence was rejected. Meanwhile, the US Treasury Department, who had continued to investigate, had found evidence of tax evasion. Other than Al, his brother Ralph Bottles Capone, Frank Nitti, and other mobsters were also being investigated. They were all charged but released shortly after. On June 16, 1931, initially Al Capone pleaded guilty to tax evasion and felonies for violating the Prohibition Act. He boasted to the press that he had reached an agreement for a 2.5-year sentence. This was not true, and the judge stated that no agreement had reached, therefore Al Capone pleaded not guilty. On October 18, 1931, at the conclusion of the trial, Capone was found guilty. On November 24th, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and charged $7,692 for court costs, plus $215,000 in back tax interest. He was also sentenced to 6 months for contempt of court. Pending the appeal ruling, Capone was incarcerated in the Cook County Jail. After the rejection of the appeals, he was interned in the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, where he served part of his sentence, only to serve the remaining part in the maximum security prison of Alcatraz. On November 16, 1939, Al Capone was released after serving 7 years, 6 months, and 15 days, and paying all the fines and back taxes. During the period of imprisonment following a paresis derived from his syphilis disease, his health conditions worsened. He was admitted to a Baltimore hospital immediately upon release for nervous system disorder treatment. Once dismissed from the hospital, he was transported to his Florida home, an estate on Palm Island near Miami that he had purchased in 1928, to never return to Chicago. At this point, he was unable to return to his criminal businesses. In 1946, his doctor and a Baltimore psychiatrist, after a diagnostic examination, both concluded that Al Capone mentally regressed to the level of a 12-year-old boy. Capone resided on Palm Island with his wife and family without resuming criminal activities until his death after a stroke with pneumonia complications on January 25, 1947.